Well, good evening, everybody. It's so good to be able to join you all in Exodus chapter 20 tonight, talking about something of great importance in the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments. A lot of what people understand about the Ten Commandments, you might say, is based on a lot of different ideas that aren't necessarily from the scriptures. So it's important that as we look at these things, we get a good sense of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about the Ten Commandments. Let's go straight to our Bibles, why don't we? And let's do a little bit of reading to start us off in Exodus chapter 20. And we'll read the first portion of Exodus chapter 20 and what we typically call the Ten Commandments. And God spoke these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, nor shall your son, nor shall your daughter, nor shall your male servant, nor shall your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who's within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. I have a question for you. If I had asked you to give me the Ten Commandments by memory, could you have done it? We were talking about this just recently in a road trip. I think it was Ryan. Ryan, you and I were talking about it, and you said, well, what are the Ten Commandments? And I sat there, well, it's sometimes I kind of get them mixed up. I didn't think I had them in order for sure. But, they're an important thing to understand. Now, a lot of times our first reaction to the Ten Commandments is, well, that was the law of Moses, which is exactly true. In fact, we'll have to cover that point tonight. But a lot of the things of the Ten Commandments are also part of the law of Christ, and they represent concepts, all of which are in the law of Christ. And I want to make that clear for just a moment, that every concept of the Ten Commandments is found in the law of Christ. And I'll explain what that means here in just a few moments. But it's important that we understand this. Kind of interesting where we get the term the Ten Commandments, because you don't see a statement right here that says, here are the Ten Commandments. Doesn't mention anything about them being carved in stone here. We're going to find that later on in Exodus chapter 32. But here they're just a series of commands. And in fact, to enumerate them as 10 might not be as easy as you think. Hopefully I can kind of make some points about that here in just a few moments. One of the things I find interesting is all the different names that are in the Bible for the Ten Commandments. The very word that's often translated commandments is actually just words. So a lot of times what you're looking at is a statement like the 10 words. Sometimes they're called the words of the covenant, such as in Exodus 34 and verse 28. The most often used reference for the Ten Commandments is the word testimony. It's kind of interesting, that word testimony, because it's the same as the word bearing witness. So it's witnessing or testifying of something. So the testimony, Exodus 32 verse 15, it tells us the testimony was carved on 2 tablets of stone. It's called the 2 tables in Deuteronomy 9 verse 10. The tablets of testimony, Exodus. Sometimes I like to say, let's first talk about what it's not. What it's not. So let's just kind of make a couple of points here about what the Ten Commandments are and are not, by first of all saying what they are not. The Ten Commandments and the law, well, they're not the most important commands of the Old Testament, right? In fact, I'll tell you what, give me the answer here. What is the most important commands that God gives in the Old Testament? What are the most important commands? They're not in the Ten Commandments. They're separate from the Ten Commandments. And this is actually something that gets asked a couple of times in the New Testament. What are the most important commands of the Old Testament? They're not in the Ten Commandments, though, so this means that the Ten Commandments don't represent the most important laws, the most important rules that were made. I'd also say that they don't represent either just the moral laws or just the ceremonial laws. I'm not even sure I would stick to say that the law of Moses has, moral and ceremonial. And some people would say, well, the moral stayed and the ceremonial went away with Christ. I don't think that's exactly accurate either. So we wouldn't say that they're moral laws, because some of these things are things that would in their commandment form pass away. And finally, they're not separate from the law of Moses. Let me come back to that last point, because I got some answers here. You guys got it. Debbie got it and Grant got it. Debbie got the second one of the two great commands. Grant got the second and the first. The second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. But the first and most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And upon these two, all of the law and the prophets are built. So the Ten Commandments isn't the most important laws of the Old Testament. To love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the most important commandments of the Old Testament. They're also the foundation of the law of the New Testament as well. So somebody comes to you and says, well, the Ten Commandments represent the most important laws. That's not true. And sometimes some people would say that the Ten Commandments represent a law that never goes away. And that's also not true, in part because we know that some of these rules existed before the Ten Commandments, and we'll come back and talk about that. But also, at least one of these commandments was done away by Christ. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a while as well. So we're told repeatedly that the Ten Commandments are in fact part of the law of Moses. Indeed, they're what we might call a preamble to the law of Moses. That might be the term that we would use to describe them, a preamble to something. You might consider, for example, that when Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes are the preamble to the giving of the law of Christ. So as Jesus is giving us the law of Christ, the Beatitudes represent kind of the preamble to that. Maybe another way to consider that is that they're a witness. That's that word testimony. They're a witness of the covenant of God. Some people see the idea of the two tablets given. Some people think, well, it doesn't really describe how it was done, but they think maybe some of them were written on one tablet and some of them were written on the other. But it's also very likely, in fact, I would say it's probably more likely, that all 10 were written on each tablet. And the idea was one tablet went to the people and one tablet was retained by God. That's kind of how covenants were done in those days. So it's very possible that it represents the idea that these things were the testimony of the law of God. And that's a pretty neat idea as I think of this. The idea that these things written in stone by the finger of God, we don't find that out till Exodus 32. But these things that were written in stone by the very finger of God, the Bible says, are a testimony of God's covenant with Israel, God's expectations of Israel. And that's important because it goes back to that idea that you can't have a covenant if you don't have rules. Not going to go into that tonight, but one of the big ideas of a covenant is you cannot have a covenant. A covenant does not exist if there are not rules or laws attached to it. So that's an idea as well. Another thing you might think of is you might think of it as the Constitution. And I just realized I misspelled Constitution there. I'm going to blame that on my editor as I look at that. But they're the Constitution, like the Constitution is to our laws. You know, the Constitution, kind of an interesting idea. In our country, it's a document. In England, it's the Queen. The Queen is the Constitution. She's a living embodiment of the Constitution of law. She embodies the theory of law. So the Ten Commandments embodied the law. They were a typification or a typology of the law. The Constitution is not all of our laws. In fact, very few of our laws are in the Constitution. Our laws were created by an authority that comes out of the Constitution. But the idea is the Constitution is the authority for all law. So the Ten Commandments might serve as something like that as well, an authority for the making of law. I kind of like that idea because you might consider what's said here in Deuteronomy 4 and verse 13. Let me make that a little bigger for you. God, here is Moses speaking, and he says that God declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, the Ten Commandments. Here's interesting as he uses this terminology, the Ten Commandments, because here what he's trying to say is that the Ten Commandments are the covenant. Now, the covenant is all the other things as well, right? We understand that. But the point is that the Ten Commandments are a typifying of that covenant. So what are the Ten Commandments? Let's kind of talk for a couple of minutes about these things. I'd love to hear if you've got comments about the Ten Commandments or thoughts on them as we kind of pull them up and talk about them here. Throw your comments in the chat. I'd love to hear what you have to say about some of these things. As we look at the Ten Commandments, the way we consider this, and I'm going to be careful to say, here in just a moment, we're going to say that sometimes people look at the Ten Commandments a little differently. But we typically say that the first commandment is found in verse 3. Some people think it's verse 2, and verse 2 and 3 are actually the same, and that's okay. But let's go ahead and call it verse 3 here for the sake of our study, and say that the very first commandment is this: you cannot have any other gods before me. Well, does that mean that we can actually have other gods so long as God is preeminent? Well, we would actually understand that by other teachings and such, that no gods at all were to be tolerated. That God absolutely demanded exclusivity in worship. It's kind of interesting when you look at the patriarchs beforehand. We understand that they might have struggled a little bit with this idea. You look at like Rachel and her hiding idols and things like that. But the big idea is that the guys that really loved God, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and those committed to him, they understood that if God was God, there were no other gods worth considering. So God's very first commandment is this: you cannot have any other gods. God, the term later would be used, is that God is a jealous God, and he refuses to share his godship with those that are not gods. And oftentimes God would say that you worship things that are not gods because there are no other gods. Love to talk a little more about that idea, but for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and move on unless you throw some comments in there about it. The second comment here in verse 4 is that you shall not make a graven image. Now, graven is not the term that's used in every translation. I think the New King James didn't. It used the term a carved image. And graven just means the idea of any image that's carved out of stone or wood or molded, fashioned in any way, that he goes on to say that is a representation of anything in heaven above, in the earth beneath, in the water under the earth. He says anything like that. Now, here's a question for you. Are there any exceptions to that rule? Okay, tricky question here. Are there any exceptions to the second commandment? You cannot have any graven images. And he says of God, of anything that's in heaven, anything on the earth, you shall not bow down to them or serve them. Are there any examples or exceptions of something that was permitted as a graven image? Can you think of anything in the Old Testament that might have been that way? So God says, secondly, that we're not supposed to make images of him and pray to them, to make images of these things. Now, this is important because we would come to understand that this hasn't changed. So Teresa's got one. She says the bronze snake in the wilderness. Well, that's a good one because that's something that's on the earth, right? The bronze snake was carved, was folded, manufactured by God's order. Now, Grant's got another one. Well, Grant says the ark. Grant, I'm looking for what's on top of the ark. What was on top of the ark? Monique goes to the bronze serpent as well, remembering that that's something that was fashioned, that was on earth. What were the things that were on top of the ark, though, as we think of the ark? Do you remember? I'm looking for someone. You're going to throw it out there in just a second because I know you remember with that. Because that was something that was fashioned that was out of heaven. So it is the case that there were some exceptions to this. Grant remembers now the angels. There were two angels, cherubs that Rob puts down. There were two angels above the ark. So you did have some carved images, graven images of these things. But to be clear, they weren't to be worshipped. Later on, the bronze serpent was worshipped. And King Hezekiah had to destroy it because it was being worshipped. I've always found that a very fascinating story to think about. So no graven images refers to the idea of not worshiping or idolizing or adoring any image. The bronze serpent was to be looked upon. The angels were to be looked upon. The carved angels were looked upon, but they themselves were not things to be worshipped as though they actually represent God. So that's an important command to consider. As we go on here, what's the third one? We see that he goes on to say that you should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Kind of interesting. Lamar makes the point. He says most of the Ten Commandments carry a curse or death penalty as the punishment. And this tells us how serious God is about obedience. Lamar, that's a great comment. And I love to make the point to say that in Hebrews 10, the Hebrew writer says that was the law of Moses. And he says, how much worse do you think it is in the law of Christ? So that's a really neat point for us to consider there, Lamar. And I appreciate you saying that. These were all death penalty commands. I'm trying to think, Lamar. I can't think of any that weren't. I think every one of these, well, covetousness might not have been because it was more something within the heart, but bearing false witness and lying or stealing or adultery or murder, all these things were death penalties. Covetousness might be the one that's not specified like that, but this is a great point for us to consider. Rob's asking a good question. Oh, I'm sorry. Debbie has a point. She says they also used carved boxes to hold scriptures and wore them on their foreheads. That's a really good point, Debbie. Debbie, I kind of wonder if the phylactery, and that's what they called those boxes, was something God ordained or something they created. Because while in Deuteronomy it says you would bind the word of God on your head and on your arms, I'm not sure God meant that literally as much as metaphorically. And I think there's a lot of room for debate on that, by the way. So, Debbie, that would be a good example of maybe something that they were carving out. Hadn't really thought of that one, though. So Rob says, the reason that our Bibles to this day don't translate the word Jehovah or Yahweh, but instead put the word Lord with a capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that they put that in there instead of this word Yahweh or Jehovah, as our translations would read it, is because they're still trying to take this name honorably. Originally, you might consider the idea, Rob, of taking something in vain is to take something or use something in a meaningless way. Rob, a great example of that you might be thinking of is when somebody says, oh my God. And I'm not using that in the sense just to give you a sense of what that is that we're talking about here. To say such a thing or to say the name of Jesus Christ just as a blurted statement, just as an exclamation without any point or purpose, might be a good example of what it means to take God's name in vain. It's to call on God who is holy for a meaningless reason. Kind of like what the writer in Ecclesiastes said in Ecclesiastes 5, where he said, don't go calling God's name because you're calling attention to him, and only a fool calls God's attention without actually having something worth saying. I always thought that was kind of a neat way of putting that. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, because I don't have the text right in front of me, but it's a neat point. Lisa's got a good question. Lisa says, there are plenty of images of perceived heavens or hell. Are those against number 2? They were never meant for praising, but just for a depiction of one's own heavens. Lisa, that's a really good question. In fact, like a lot of our kids' books have pictures of Jesus or the apostles or Old Testament people. They might have pictures of the burning bush and things like that. Lisa, we would say that if we're using a picture not to honor or to worship or to give some special power to, but instead just as a way of teaching something or rendering something understandable, we would say that would probably be an appropriate use of that. Now, Lisa, where that becomes tricky is at what point does somebody's mind transfer that thought to something more than that? So, for example, I walk into somebody's house and they have a cross on the wall. Is that cross merely a decoration? Or do they believe that either it represents some kind of spiritual protection on their house? I've known a lot of people that believe a cross brings a spiritual protection to their house, in which case that would be violating this second point here. Or is it just as a decoration? Well, that's iffy, and that's one of those things where even if it means one thing to one person, it could be a stumbling block to someone else. But Lisa, to answer your question, somebody draws heaven or hell. They draw Jesus. They draw God, like in the burning bush or as the dove coming down from heaven, as the fire or cloud. Some kind of homage to. That would be the very different and very dangerous thing that we're speaking of here. I appreciate those. You guys had some really good comments and observations here, and I appreciate that. And if somebody has another point to throw into either of these comments, I'd love to hear it. Throw it out there and we'll bring it up. The fourth comment was to honor the Sabbath. The word Sabbath means rest. I'd love to go into detail on this, but let's just say this. If you know that the word Sabbath means rest, and you understand that honoring the Sabbath meant not working, you understand the big ideas here. I know today there are some people that believe the Sabbath was a day of worship, and in fact there's several denominations that believe Christians should worship on the Sabbath because they They misunderstand the Old Testament, and they believe that the Jews worshipped on the Sabbath, but the Jews honored the Sabbath and kept it holy by not working. As I said, it meant a day of rest, and that's how it was observed. It's never called a day of worship in the Old Testament. And so that's an important thing for us to consider, to understand. God said, I rested on the seventh day. You rest on that day too to honor me. Moving on to the next one. The next one deals more with our commandments about people. Honor your father and your mother. This one gets a lot of attention in the New Testament. When it's repeated several different times, we're told it's the first commandment with a promise. And what we want to understand is that the promise would be in Deuteronomy that if you honor your father and mother, that your days in the land, he says, will be long. That's verse 12 here as we read this in Exodus 20 and then again in Deuteronomy chapter 5. By the way, Teresa has a good comment about the Sabbath. Teresa says, many denominational people say that Sunday is the New Testament Sabbath. And Teresa rightly says that's not true. We're going to talk about the New Testament Sabbath here in a moment, but Sunday is not the New Testament Sabbath. Sunday is the New Testament day of worship. And it corresponds to the Old Testament feast days. We already saw one back in Exodus 14, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and God would, through the law, give them other feast days as well. So it's kind of important to understand that that corresponds to the days of worship in the New Testament, not the day of rest. But we'll come back to that and elaborate on that. But Teresa, you're exactly right. The Sunday is not the New Testament or the Christian Sabbath. That would be a misstatement to what that means. The next point here, after honoring your father and mother, is do not murder. Now, I know that I think at least the King James Version says do not kill. The word here in Hebrew is a very distinct word. It doesn't mean do not kill. It means do not murder. And that would make sense since there's a lot of times where God would instruct the Israelites to kill someone. And in fact, God would make a rule that if you killed somebody by accident, that you weren't necessarily guilty of murder and you had a city of refuge that you could flee to. So it needs to be very clear that it wasn't Jesus or it wasn't God giving the Ten Commandments, that it wasn't God saying that they could not kill anyone, because there were times where they were told to kill people, is the commandment. Jesus would say, you shall not commit adultery. And adultery here, of course, is the idea of the violation of the marriage covenant. Jesus would elaborate on this in Matthew chapter 19. So adultery was in some way diminishing or violating in a sexual way the marriage covenant. And one of the Ten Commandments was you were not to do that. You were not to commit adultery. Next of the Ten Commandments, let me bring them up a little bigger, is that he says you would not steal. Verse 15, thou shalt not steal. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory, but if there's any thoughts on that, I'd sure love to hear it. The next one is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Sometimes people just say, thou shalt not lie. Later on when it's elaborated on, this is a very specific statement, in part about, telling a lie about somebody as speaking as though one has witnessed something they haven't. But in general, it just speaks to any kind of lying. You might consider Proverbs 6, verses 16 and 17, and how God speaks of the characteristics of the things that God hates. One of those things is you should not lie. Finally, the last of the Ten Commandments is a rather complicated one. In verse 17, he says, you shall not covet. And then he goes into an elaboration of your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's male servant, your neighbor's female servant, your neighbor's ox, your neighbor's donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, covet is kind of complicated because to covet and to want or desire might not exactly mean the same thing as we're thinking of them. To covet means to obsessively want, we might say. If I looked over at my neighbor's house and said, boy, that's a nice house, I wouldn't mind a house like that. That would be different than me saying, boy, I want that house more than anything. I have to have that house. We see several stories in the Old Testament of coveting, like Naboth's vineyard and King Ahab. He coveted that vineyard. Ultimately, he created a fabrication to put Naboth to death and to take that vineyard. So that's something to consider. Teresa's got a good one. She talks about David coveting Bathsheba, who was Uriah's wife. That's a great point. So we might, get a good sense of that. In fact, Teresa, I wish I had used that example because that's a really good one. Rob's got an interesting statement here. Rob says in Exodus 31, verses 16 and 17, the statement is the Sabbath was a perpetual covenant. Now, Rob has a question mark about this. He says, is this part of the physical covenant of the Old Testament law? Was this only between the Israelites before the law includes, or does it include everybody? Rob, this is a great question. So this is something I've heard several people say in the past. They've told me, well, the terminology of the Sabbath is that it is a perpetual or everlasting thing. Now, what people don't understand about that term is that every single covenant in the Bible is called an everlasting or perpetual covenant and an everlasting or perpetual law. It actually is just a term used to describe something that is of a covenant nature. Now, Rob, what I mean by that is if something is of covenant nature, that means that if we break that rule, we actually are forfeiting the things of the covenant. Now, what's interesting about the Sabbath is that God says that one of the Sabbaths was the Sabbath year, and that Israel ceased keeping the Sabbath year. And because of that, whenever they went into captivity, the amount of time that they were in captivity was 70 years, or as the Bible said, 70 Sabbath years, because they hadn't given those Sabbath years back to the land. So, Rob, what I kind of point out there is to say that God was making it clear that the reason they forfeited their covenant was in part not honoring the Sabbath. So, Rob, any commandment of the covenant of Moses was an everlasting comment, was an everlasting rule. And everlasting just means that it lasts until the covenant is fulfilled. So we want to appreciate and understand that language, Rob, and I really appreciate you bringing it to us, that we can look at the term everlasting, and what we find is that the term everlasting is used all throughout the scriptures whenever we're talking about a covenant, everlasting, perpetual, that these are all terms that God uses when he describes a covenant. Now, you kind of make the comment, was this just between the Israelites before the law of Moses or not? In fact, what's interesting about that is it specifies that this was a covenant only with Israel. So the Sabbath rule, and in fact all of the commandments of the law of Moses, were only covenant things to be kept by the Israelites. We don't read about the Sabbath being kept before the Ten Commandments. And so that's an important point to consider. Rob, I kind of hope that answers your question. If not, I actually have some material that I can share with you, or we can share later, that might help to answer that about that term everlasting. It's an important question, Rob. It's one you need to know, because a lot of people will say the reason they should keep the Sabbath today is because it's called everlasting. And all you need to do is just plug into some kind of search parameter of the Bible that term everlasting, and you'll see every time it's used in connection with a covenant. There are a lot of different covenants in the Bible, and they're all called everlasting, and the rules of them are spoken of as everlasting. I got a comment from Debbie. Debbie Watkins says, coveting often involves doing whatever is necessary to obtain a thing, even if that means doing the wrong things. Debbie, what's great about your example is that would fit nicely to David and Bathsheba, right? Or Ahab, coveting a vineyard, that would fit nicely in that story. Anthony makes the comment, consider Ananias and Sapphira. They coveted appearance. Now that's interesting, Anthony. I hadn't really thought of it that way. They coveted a righteous appearance by their brethren. And they wanted to seem more generous than they were. So that's interesting, Anthony. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but that does kind of fit the idea of coveting. Now, Lamar has a comment that's interesting about stealing. Lamar says, stealing is usually thought of as simply taking something, but can also refer to getting something by dishonest gain. God, even in the Old Testament, looks at intent as the same in the New Testament. You know, it's interesting, Lamar. One of the things that God spoke of as an abomination in the Old Testament were dishonest scales. Meaning when you bought and sold things, if you had your scales and it was supposed to be a pound of this for a pound of that, and you kind of altered the scales so that it was a little more than a pound, a little less than a pound. God actually called that an abomination, repeatedly, multiple times. He said dishonest scales are an abomination to God. So Lamar, what's interesting about that is that dishonest scales are stealing. That's a dishonest gain. When we talk about stealing in the New Testament, sometimes people are surprised when we include gambling. But gambling is a dishonest gain. It's taking something from somebody, even if they were willing to let it be stolen from them. It's a willingness to be robbed. They don't really want to give it to you, but they're giving it to you because of this dishonest gain that gambling is involved with. So that's an important point for us to consider, and I appreciate that statement being made. So as we consider these things, let's kind of jump to a different idea here for a moment. I said earlier that one of the unusual things about the Ten Commandments is that their enumeration, the counting of the Ten Commandments, is something that's kind of counted a little bit unusually. In other words, we're creating the numbers on these, right? The Bible says there were 10 of them, but there's a lot of different views on how those 10 ought to be counted. Let me show you an example of what I'm saying. Here's 4 different ways that the Ten Commandments are counted by people today. So if you're talking to someone who's Jewish and you said, well, the Ten Commandments, they're going to count the statement that the Lord your God, I am the Lord your God, is the first commandment. Now, one of the reasons we don't count that as a commandment is because we don't really see a commandment in that. We're not exactly sure that that's something you can do, unless a lot of Jews believe that requires them to believe that God exists. So if belief is that first commandment, they would see it in that manner. And they see the idea of having no other gods a part of the commandment with having no idols either. One of the difficult things I see about that too is that the concept of idols is very different from the concept of having other gods, because you can also have idols, and you also see the things of idols as being made of Jehovah God. So that doesn't necessarily put that in that case. Orthodox churches. Then Orthodox churches are like the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox churches. They count both the first verse and the second verse as being the first commandment. So I think it's a very reasonable assertion that it might be that they are in fact both the commandment. In fact, I would have no problem with seeing it that way. Now, the Catholic Church and Lutheran churches, they bring these first things as one commandment, and then they split the covetousness commandment to coveting your neighbor's house versus coveting your neighbor's wife. So they kind of make those things as a little bit different there as well. So, and how they consider those things, they look at those things differently, and in seeing those things differently, it isn't exactly the case that they're actually pulling verses out, but they're enumerating them differently. And one of the questions I'm going to ask you in a little bit is, why might they do that? What kind of motivations might you have? Don't answer it yet. We'll talk about it here in just a few moments. Lisa's got a comment here. Lisa says, I think some people look at the numbers and think most important to least important. Lisa, you're exactly right. I've often said that a lot of people see a church's success by the number of people there. And, sometimes I have to admit, to me, that's a temptation I have to avoid, because God often makes it clear that he's not a God of numbers. I really like that comment, Lisa, because I think it's an important one for us to consider, that God is not counting things by numbers. So let's go ahead. I'll tell you what, for the sake of time, I wanted to finish the last part of the chapter and go into the what I would call the fear of the people. And it is interesting that for verses 18 through 26, we see the children of Israel quite scared and quite concerned because of what's going on. And what I've always thought was interesting is that they say, Moses, you talk to God because we're afraid if we talk to God, we'll die. Moses says, well, God is testing you right now, and he wants you to understand and to learn what it is to fear God. I think this is important. I'd like to spend a little more time on it, but we're not going to. But what I do want to point out is he goes on to say that if you're going to worship God, he says, you need to make an altar, and that altar needs to be made out of stone or dirt. But then in verse 25, he makes an unusual rule. He says you're not to ever use tools to make the altar. I've always found this a fascinating command. And I'm going to be frank, I'm not sure I entirely understand God's reasoning here in saying, if you make me an altar, you can't mark it with tools. You can't fashion it up. Is it speaking to the idea that the altar itself becomes something people worship? And that could be the case, but unusually God is going to give them a lot of commands to make some very intricate and beautiful, ornate things. So that doesn't necessarily ring true. Does it also speak perhaps to something about the nature of Jesus being the stone that was rejected, becoming the cornerstone of the kingdom? And while I think that's possible, it also seems a little bit of a reach as well. If somebody has a comment about that, I'd love to hear it. I'd love you to educate me on this one. I'd like to understand this one better too. I think it's an interesting commandment, that I'm not sure I have a great understanding of. Got one more comment here from Lamar. Lamar says, coveting in this list shows again that God was not only concerned with external actions, but also internal thoughts. You know what's interesting, Lamar? This really is the central statement of the Ten Commandments that really is an internal command, that really is something that spoke entirely to the heart. All the rest of these commandments, there was some visible thing that had to be done or not done, but the covetous command was interesting because that was one entirely in the heart. So I find that interesting, Lamar, that you see that as well, and that is a very interesting observation. Well, let's jump to our questions. Stephen, I skipped your comment because I want to come back to this, and I want to explore some of this as well. I see your comment about the graven images. You're wondering about that might be where the tools being used could end up being used, and that could be the case, Stephen. I had mentioned before, maybe they were just afraid of worshiping something they might carve. I'm just not sure what to think of that. That's a good comment, though. So let's go ahead and grab our questions here. Oh, it looks like I got one more comment from Grant. Grant says, the altar is the place where sin is covered up by sacrifices. Maybe the idea is that if sin is ugly, then so should the altar be. I hadn't thought of that one, Grant. That actually is a really good point. I wonder if that's true. If maybe the point of the altar was it wasn't supposed to be something beautiful or attractive, that because of the nature of sin, and the altar was the place where sin was propitiated, it was supposed to be something not desired or not looked upon beautifully. That could be a really good point, Grant. I like that a lot. Let's go ahead and grab some questions here. So here are the 10 Commandments, and as I've already mentioned, the fact that there are 10 of them is more symbolic than anything else. So what are some other things that came in tens in the Bible? Can you think of some other things that were grouped in tens? I think there's one that's probably pretty easy from our study so far in Exodus, and Debbie's got it. She remembers that there were 10 plagues. Very good, Debbie. So we saw 10 plagues to get out of Egypt, and now God is giving them 10 rules that speak to the speak to the law that they're going to be receiving. Monique remembers the story of the 10 lepers. That's interesting, Monique. I hadn't thought of that one. The 10 lepers were only one returned to praise God. I like that. That's a really good point. Looking to see if anybody else comes up. George, I forgot about this. 10 bad spies, 2 good spies. I forgot about that. 10 tribes of Israel. That the northern tribes were 10 tribes, broken off 10 and 2. So that's a good one too. Debbie remembers the parable of the 10 foolish virgins, the 10 virgins, the foolish virgins and the wise virgins, there in Matthew 25. That's a good one too. You guys are thinking of a lot of them I didn't think of. The 10 plagues was probably the one that was most prominent to my mind. What else have you got? You got any others? I'll tell you what, if you want to throw some more up there, let's ask this question. Of the 10 commandments, what commandments existed before this? Which of these laws were rules before this? Can you think of that for a minute? Of the 10 commandments, which of the commandments were commandments beforehand? Which of the laws existed beforehand? And I'm probably looking for, if you can think of an example of that even, that's more what I'm hoping we can find here as an example of what that might be. Rob throws out one that's interesting. Rob throws out tithing as far as our things that are grouped in 10. So tithing was something that was done in tens. It was 10%. That's what the word tithe means. That's interesting, Rob. Rob, I hadn't thought of that one either. The parable of the lost coin, she lost one and had 10. So that's a good one too, Grant. I hadn't thought of that. 10 virgins, Grant, you got that one. So murder, number one, murder was a sin because we see that with Cain. Very good, Lindsay. And that's the kind of examples I'm looking for. We know it was a crime because God held him accountable for it. So we know murder was already on the table. Stephen James got that out of Genesis 9 in the law of Moses, or the law of Noah, sorry. So Noah's law was that murder was a sin. That's very good. You think of any others? Kind of some tricky ones. I'll help you here to say, not to take the name of the Lord God in vain. Well, they didn't know God's name until God gave it to Moses, so we can take that one off the list. I already told you that the Sabbath wasn't honored before this. Now, God had made the Sabbath his day of rest way back in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. But the point is that it wasn't actually a commandment that men honored until the Israelites, so we might take those two off. Teresa has lying. Now, Teresa, what's interesting about that is how do we know lying was a sin? I agree. And I think we can think of some examples of that where lying was a sin. I think of 3 or 4 examples actually where we know lying was a sin. So, Teresa, what would that be? Can you think of any of those where somebody lied and it was a sin? They were held or feared to be held accountable for it. Can you think of that? And as we think of this, as we move on, let's didn't Eve covet the tree? So, the idea of it looking the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life, Stephen, I would say that covet might well fit into this, that she coveted these things. She desired these things. We might point to several different times where men coveted things from each other. So that's good. Teresa says when they took something not allowed and hid it and lied about it, I'm trying to think. I was thinking of Achan, but that's actually not accurate because Achan was later. So are you thinking maybe of Benjamin? I'll tell you which one I was thinking of, Teresa. I was thinking whenever Jacob was told to deceive his father, and he said, if I deceive my father, I can get cursed. So he understood that deception was something you could be cursed for. Debbie thought of the other one I was thinking of, Abraham lying about Sarah. And then, of course, I was also thinking of Isaac lying about Rebekah being his wife. And in both instances, they were both rebuked, mainly by the men of their time for that. Now, by the way, there's also another command in the story of Abraham and Sarah and lying about Sarah being his wife. One of the other 10 commandments was something that God said, I'm going to kill you for breaking this rule. He said this to somebody else whenever Abraham lied about Sarah. Anybody remember? Anybody remember what that was? If you remember the king, his name was Abimelech, and he was going to take Sarah as his wife, and God said, that's a married woman. I'm going to kill you for this. It was adultery. And God had said to a pagan king that he would kill him for adultery. Now, by the way, that tells us that adultery was a sin to all people, to all men. Stephen, remember that? It was Abimelech. That's right. Abimelech was told by God, you're going to die for taking another man's wife. So adultery was also a sin. So what's interesting about these things is we see lying. We could talk about stealing and some of the sense of Jacob stealing the birthright and how that was condemned, how he dishonored his father by this lie. We could talk about how that was condemned too, not honoring his father and mother. But frankly, we see most of these commands. To have no other God. We know that Jacob was blessed by God because he made the commitment that God would be his only God. And we get the sense that by not doing that, they were condemned. So really about half of these commands we see already existed. And I think it's kind of important for us to consider that idea because it helps us to get a sense of what it was that the 10 Commandments were all about. They weren't something entirely new. They were things that had, in fact, existed for a while. As we move forward, how did one take the name of God in vain? Rob, you'd asked that earlier. We talked about that quite a bit earlier. So I'm just going to say, hopefully we kind of covered this. And what about now? Well, the Bible says we're actually blaspheming the name of God when we live sinfully. So I'm just going to give you that answer here. As we move on, Grant, I'm sorry, I know you're trying to help me out with the questions, but I'm going to skip over these. Let's go ahead and say, what was the Sabbath, a day of rest? What is the Sabbath today for Christians? I told you we would cover that. Hebrews chapter 4 says that the Sabbath today, the Christian Sabbath, is our eternal rest with God in heaven. So we do have a Sabbath, we just haven't reached it yet. We have an eternal rest with God in heaven. That's the Christian Sabbath that we're looking ahead to. When it comes back to the idea of taking the name of God in vain for us today, George had an answer here. He said it involves more than just using his name right. It also involves our actions. It's interesting, George. I didn't think of this, but you went back to the Old Testament and you demonstrated that that's an Old Testament statement with the prayer of Agur. And I find that interesting in Proverbs 30. I hadn't thought of that. But in verse 9, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? And yes, lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. George, I hadn't really thought about it. But even in the Old Testament, it was that way well. So that's a really good point, George. You kind of taught me something I hadn't thought about before, and I appreciate that idea. One more comment, and I'm going to go to this one only because Stephen James had mentioned it earlier. And I had asked the question about the different lists of the Ten Commandments. And this was a comment that Stephen James had made. Stephen James said, "It occurred to me that the Catholic Church eliminated the second commandment to avoid the guilt of flagrantly disobeying it, and then invented their ninth commandment to compensate." Actually, Stephen, that was the answer I was thinking of. This is kind of why I think that the Ten Commandments are different to a Catholic list than most lists, because that command for graven images seems to be something that they are pretty, as you said, and I agree, they're pretty flagrant about disobeying and breaking. So it seems like they actually got rid of that commandment so that they can't be accused of breaking it per se. So I find that very interesting. Wish we could have gone into some of our discussions and other points, but we really have run ourselves out of time. We really had some great comments tonight, and I just really appreciate them, and I'm thankful for all the observations we had. I learned a few things tonight. I hope you did too, as we looked at these things, and so may God bless you in the remainder of this week.